The heat in Red Mesa did not merely sit upon the town. It pressed down with the heavy, suffocating weight of a wool blanket soaked in hot water. It was the summer of 1878, and the Colorado Territory was a place where the dust tasted of copper and old regrets. The sun, a relentless white eye in a bleached sky, had finally begun to dip toward the jagged spine of the western mountains, painting the horizon in violent shades of bruised purple and blood orange. Inside the rusty Spur saloon, the air was thick enough to chew. It smelled of stale beer, unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil. A piano player in the corner, a man with a derby hat pulled low over his eyes, hammered out a tune that sounded manic and cheerful, a jarring contrast to the sullen exhaustion of the miners who slumped over the scarred wooden tables. Clara Boone moved through the mist like a shadow that had learned to be useful. She was in her late 20s, though the harsh wind and the relentless sun of the frontier had etched fine lines around her eyes that made her appear older. She was a tall woman, too thin by the standards of the day, with no softness to her hips or bosom to catch a wandering eye. Her hair, the color of dried mud, was pulled back severely from a face that was all sharp angles and high cheekbones, skin browned deep by the sun. She carried a heavy tray laden with amber whiskey and warm beer, her hands steady despite the fatigue that throbbed in her legs. Clara was not a saloon girl by trade. By day, she took in mending and taught the few town children their letters in the back of the livery stable. But survival in Red Mesa cost money, more than a needle and thread could provide. And so she worked the evening shift at the Spur, invisible in plain sight. "Hey, Boone!" a miner shouted, his voice slurred with drink. He was a large man named Silas Miller, no relation to the Tycoon rumored to be coming, but just a common laborer with coal dust permanently under his fingernails. He slammed his empty glass onto the table as she passed. "Bring another round here, and try to smile, girl. It might crack that stone face of yours, but it would not hurt to try." Laughter rippled through the table. Clara paused, her spine stiffening. She did not look at him. She simply placed a fresh bottle on the table and picked up the empty one. "Leave her be, Miller," another man grunted, though his defense was laced with cruelty. "You cannot polish a rock. Look at her. She is built like a rail fence and has a face like a closed fist." "I just said she should smile," Miller retorted, leaning back and eyeing Clara with a mixture of pity and dismissal. He raised his voice, ensuring the room could hear him over the piano. "It is a kindness, really. A woman needs charm if she lacks looks, and her she is too plain. Too ugly to marry, that is what everyone says. Is it not destined to be a spinster until the dust takes her? Too plain, too ugly to marry." The words hung in the air, heavier than the cigar smoke. The phrase was not new. Clara had heard whispers of it in the general store, seen it in the pitying glances of the few wives who lived in town. But hearing it shouted, stripped of all pretense, felt like a physical blow to the stomach. Clara felt the heat rush to her face, a burning flush that she could not control. She stared fixedly at the wet ring the bottle had left on the wood. For a second, she wanted to shatter the bottle over Miller's head. She wanted to scream that she knew more about the stars and the soil than he would learn in 10 lifetimes, but she did neither. She swallowed the bile in her throat, dipped her chin, and turned away. It was the armor she had forged over 10 years of solitude. Let them talk. Let them laugh. They saw only the shell. $2 for the round, Clara said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. Miller threw the coins on the table, laughing as one rolled off the edge onto the floor. "Keep the change. Boone, buy yourself a ribbon. Maybe it will help." Clara bent to retrieve the coin from the sawdust-covered floor. Her jaw set so hard her teeth ached. She was invisible. She was nothing. Suddenly, the bat-wing doors of the saloon swung open with a violent crash that silenced the piano instantly. The laughter died in Miller's throat. Every head in the room turned. The bartender reached beneath the counter, his hand closing around the handle of a shotgun. Standing in the doorway, framed by the dying light of the sunset, were 5 figures. They were Shoshone warriors. Dust coated their buckskin leggings and the dark braids of their hair. They carried rifles, not bows, and they did not look like they had come to trade. At the front stood Ravenhawk. He was a terrifyingly beautiful sight to the townsfolk, a man carved from mahogany and iron. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes as black and sharp as obsidian. He wore a single eagle feather in his hair, and a scar ran jagged across his left pectoral, visible where his shirt fell open. He scanned the room, his posture relaxed but ready to coil and strike like a rattlesnake. The tension in the room spiked to a breaking point. The miners hated the Shoshone, feared them, and coveted the land they still held in the northern valley. "We do not serve Indians," the bartender barked, leveling his shotgun. "Get out, now!" Ravenhawk did not flinch. He spoke in his native tongue, a deep, resonant sound that rolled like thunder in the small space. He gestured with an open hand, but his eyes were cold. The miners looked at each other, confused and angry. Hands hovered over pistol grips. A single misunderstanding, a single twitch, and the room would turn into a slaughterhouse. "He says," a clear, calm female voice cut through the silence, "that he is not here for your whiskey." The room shifted its collective gaze. Clara Boone had stepped out from the shadows of the back corner. She set her tray down on a barrel and walked into the open space between the shotgun-wielding bartender and the Shoshone warriors. "Clara, get back," Miller hissed. "You want to get killed?" Clara ignored him. She walked until she stood 3 feet from Ravenhawk. The townspeople watched, mouths agape, as the plain, ugly spinster looked the fierce warrior in the eye. She did not tremble. She did not look down. She spoke to him. It was not English. It was Shoshone fluid, complex, and spoken with a native inflection that shocked the listening men. Her voice, usually so quiet and hesitant, was now strong, carrying the guttural and melodic tones of the mountains. Ravenhawk's expression softened imperceptibly. He replied, his voice lower, a rapid stream of words accompanied by a gesture toward the livery stable outside. Clara nodded. She turned to the bartender. "They are tracking a horse thief," she translated, her voice cool and authoritative. "A man from the south stole a mare with distinct markings 2 days ago. They tracked him to the edge of town. They want to know if a man riding a spotted mare passed through. If he did, they would leave. If you hide him, they will burn the stable to flush him out." The bartender lowered his shotgun a fraction, blinking in confusion. "A spotted mare? Yeah, Crazy Pete brought one in this morning. Said he wanted in a card game. It is in the back stall." Clara turned back to Ravenhawk and relayed the information in his tongue. She added something else, a soft phrase that made Ravenhawk incline his head in a gesture of respect. He looked at Clara, really looked at her, ignoring the room full of armed white men. For a fleeting second, the hardness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a warmth that no one else noticed. He raised a hand, palm out, to her. "Suvate," he said softly. "Suvat," Clara whispered back. Ravenhawk signaled his men. They turned as one and vanished back into the red dust of the street. A moment later, the sound of hoofbeats thundered toward the livery stable, followed by a shout from Crazy Pete. But no gunshots. They had come for the horse, not blood. Inside the saloon, the silence stretched for 10 long seconds. "Well, I'll be damned," the bartender breathed, lowering his gun completely. Clara picked up her tray. The miners stared at her as if she had suddenly grown a second head. The girl they had just mocked for being useless and dull had just prevented a massacre. How do you know what they talk about, girl?" Miller asked, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "I listen," Clara said simply. She did not explain. She did not tell them that language was the only bridge she had ever known. She wiped a table, her face returning to its mask of indifference, but her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Later that night, after the moon had risen high and pale over the mesas, Clara sat on the steps of the back porch of the boarding house where she rented a single room. The air had cooled, but the stone of the building still radiated the day's heat. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift back, as she often did when the loneliness became too loud. She remembered the winter of 1868. She had been 18 then. Her father, Elias Boone, a dreamer and a drunkard who chased gold dust like it was salvation, had dragged her deep into the high country. He had died of a fever in a makeshift lean-to, leaving Clara alone as a blizzard buried the world in white. She would have died there. She had curled up next to her father's cold body, waiting for the sleep that did not end. That was when Ravenhawk had found her. He was young then, barely 20. On his first solo hunt, he had not seen a white invader. He had seen a dying creature. He had carried her through snowdrifts that reached his waist, brought her to his grandmother's winter lodge, and laid her by the fire. For 3 months. Clara had lived with the Shoshone. They called her Sugwa, meaning willow, because she bent in the wind but did not break. Ravenhawk had taught her to read the signs of the earth. He taught her that the wolf does not howl to scare the moon, but to find his pack. He taught her that silence was a language of its own. They had become something, not lovers, a white woman and a Shoshone brave. It was forbidden by every law of her world, and perhaps his too, but they were souls cut from the same cloth of solitude. Earlier tonight, in the saloon, when he had looked at her, she had felt that familiar ache, a pull in the center of her chest. But then she remembered the miner's words. Too plain, too ugly. Ravenhawk was a warrior, a prince of the high desert. He was magnificent. And she was Clara Boone, the spinster with the mud-colored hair. He treated her with honor, with the affection one might have for a sister or a rescued bird. He could never look at her with desire. She had convinced herself of this truth so thoroughly that it was now the foundation of her world. A noise in the shadows startled her. She looked up to see a horse tethered near the water trough at the edge of the alley. It was a black stallion, wild-eyed and restless. It was Ravenhawk's horse, Nightwind. No one could ride the beast but him. Ravenhawk stepped out of the shadows. He had stayed behind while his men took the mare back. "The town is quiet," he said in English. His English was accented but precise, another secret he shared only with her. "They are drinking themselves to sleep," Clara replied. Standing up, she smoothed her apron, self-conscious. "You should not be here, Raven. If the sheriff sees you—" "The sheriff is fat and blind," Ravenhawk said with a faint smirk. He stepped closer, smelling of sagebrush and horse sweat. "I wanted to thank you for the words in there. You stopped blood from spilling." "They are fools," Clara said bitterly. "They would have shot you just for breathing." "They are afraid," he corrected. "Fear makes men into wolves." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "You look tired." "Clara, this place, it eats the spirit." "It is a job," she said defensively. "I have rent to pay." "Come back to the mountains," he said, as he had said a dozen times before. "My grandmother asks for you. The river is clear there." "I cannot," Clara whispered. "You know why." Ravenhawk went silent. He knew. He nodded slowly. He reached out and, with a gesture startlingly tender, brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. Clara froze, her breath hitching. His skin was rough, warm. "You guard it well," he said cryptically. "But the storm is coming. Sugwa, the eagles are circling." He swung onto the black stallion in one fluid motion. With a nod, he turned the horse and vanished into the darkness, leaving Clara standing alone with her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The next morning, the air in Red Mesa felt different. It was brittle, charged with electricity. Harlan Pike was holding court in the center of the dusty main street. Standing on a crate outside the land office, Pike was a man who looked like he was made of suet and expensive whiskey. He wore a suit that was too tight for his girth and a hat that cost more than Clara earned in a year. He was the town's unofficial king, a man who owned the existing copper mines and squeezed every ounce of profit from the earth and the men who worked it. Clara, on her way to the mercantile to buy thread, was forced to stop as a crowd gathered. "Listen to me," Pike bellowed, his face flushed red. "Do you think the copper is drying up? You think Red Mesa is dying, I tell you. The boom is just starting." A murmur went through the crowd. "I have received a telegram," Pike shouted, waving a piece of paper. "Mr. Silas Caro is coming. You hear that name, Caro, the Gold King of the East. He is bringing capital. He is bringing machinery. And we are going to open up the Northern Valley." Clara felt a cold hand grip her heart. The Northern Valley, the Shoshone land, the place where the river sings. "That is Indian territory. Pike," a voice shouted from the back. "Not for long." Pike laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Caro has the government in his pocket. We will drive those savages back to the reservations where they belong. That valley is wasted on them. It is full of gold. Boys, gold enough to pave this street." He spat on the ground. "And any Indian or Indian lover who stands in the way will be crushed. Progress is coming to Red Mesa, and I am holding the reins." His eyes scanned the crowd and landed on Clara. He sneered. "Even the little spinster Boone might find a husband if she had a gold nugget in her pocket. Eh?" The crowd laughed, obedient to Pike's power. Clara gripped her basket until the wicker creaked. She turned and walked away, her steps measured, refusing to run. But inside, panic was rising like floodwater. She hurried back to her boarding house, bolted the door of her small room, and pulled the curtains shut against the harsh sun. The room was sparse, an iron bed, a wash basin, a trunk at the foot of the bed. In the corner hung a mirror with a jagged crack running down the center. Clara avoided it. She knew what she would see: a face that was too sharp, eyes that were too serious, a mouth that did not know how to pout or flirt, too plain. She knelt by the trunk and unlocked it. Beneath layers of wool and linen, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a piece of tanned deer hide. She unfolded it on the floor. It was a map. It was drawn in charcoal and ochre, sketching the twisting path of the river through the high canyon walls of the Northern Valley. Her father's hand had marked a specific bend in the river with a heavy X. "It is not just dust." "Clara," her father's voice whispered in her memory, rasping with the fever that took him. "It is a vein, a mother lode, pure gold, sitting right under the water. But listen to me. Gold drives men mad. It turns good men into devils. It is cursed." He had gripped her hand, his dying grip surprisingly strong. "Promise me. You hold this map. You hold the claim, but you only touch it. You only reveal it. When you find a man who loves the land more than the metal, otherwise let it sleep. Let the river keep it." For 10 years, Clara had kept the secret. She had watched men like Pike tear up the earth for copper and silver, leaving behind poisoned water and scarred hills. She knew what they would do to the singing river. And now, a Tycoon was coming. Silas Caro. A man made of money. A man coming to consume the world she and Ravenhawk held sacred. Clara stood up and went to the window. She climbed out onto the small slant of the roof that overlooked the town. From here, she could look past the squalid buildings of Red Mesa, past the smoke and the dust. Toward the north, the mountains stood silent, purple giants guarding the horizon. Somewhere in those folds of rock lay the valley. She felt small. She was one woman, armed with a needle and a secret, standing against the tide of history. She was the woman no one wanted, the woman they laughed at. But as she touched the pocket of her dress where the key to the trunk lay, Clara's jaw tightened. Let Pike laugh. Let this Silas Caro come with his silk suits and his Eastern money. They saw a plain woman. They did not see the storm. She looked at the sky. Dark clouds were gathering over the peaks, heavy with rain and lightning. The wind picked up, whipping a strand of hair across her face. It smelled of ozone and wet earth. "Let them come," she whispered to the wind. The storm was about to break. The arrival of the Iron Horse in Red Mesa was never a quiet affair. But on this particular Tuesday in late July of 1878, the train screamed into the station with a ferocity that seemed to challenge the very mountains themselves. The locomotive was a black iron beast, belching thick plumes of coal smoke that stained the pristine blue sky. grinding its metal wheels against the rails until sparks flew like angry fireflies. The entire town had gathered at the platform. They were a motley collection of hopeful, desperate men, women with faces hardened by the wind, and miners who smelled of subterranean dampness. They watched with bated breath as the steam hissed and the heavy doors of the private carriage opened. A set of polished leather boots stepped onto the warped wooden planks of the platform, followed by trousers of fine wool that had never known the bite of a briar patch. Silas Caro had arrived. He was a man in his early 30s, tall and imposing, though not in the rugged, heavy-muscled way of the miners. His power was lean and sharp. He wore a tailored frock coat that cost more than the Red Mesa saloon earned in 6 months, and a silk cravat was tied precisely at his throat. His face was handsome but guarded, his eyes the color of cold steel, scanning the dusty town with the calculating detachment of a predator assessing a new hunting ground. Behind him trailed 2 men who looked like frightened crows. One was a lawyer, clutching a leather satchel to his chest as if it contained the crown jewels. The other was an accountant, furiously wiping his spectacles with a handkerchief, overwhelmed by the heat and the glare. Harlan Pike pushed his way through the crowd, his face slick with sweat and eagerness. "Mr. Caro," Pike bellowed, extending a hand that was too eager. "Welcome to Red Mesa. Welcome to the future." Silas looked at the hand for a fraction of a second before shaking it briefly. "Mr. Pike," Silas said, his voice a smooth baritone that carried without effort. "I trust the arrangements for the meeting are made. My time is expensive, and the journey was long." Of course, Pike stammered, gesturing grandly toward the rusty spur. "The whole town is waiting. We are ready to hear how you are going to make us all rich." Silas adjusted his cuffs, a flash of gold catching the sun. "Let us not get ahead of ourselves. I am here to do business, not to perform miracles. But if the geology reports are accurate, wealth will follow." He began to walk toward the saloon, his boots crunching on the red earth. He moved with an air of ownership that made the locals step back instinctively. From the shadows of the station overhang, Clara Boone watched him. She held her basket of mending tight against her chest. She saw the way he looked at the town not as a home, not as a community, but as a column of numbers to be balanced. And she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. An hour later, the rusty spur was packed so tight a man could hardly draw a breath without inhaling his neighbor's tobacco smoke. Harlan Pike had cleared the center of the room, setting up a table for Silas and his entourage. The miners crowded around, standing on chairs, leaning over the balcony, their eyes wide with greed and desperation. Clara stood at the very back, near the kitchen doors. She should have gone home. She knew she should have hidden in her room with her cracked mirror and her silence. But the map in her trunk burned in her mind. She had to know what they intended for the valley. Silas stood up. He removed his hat, placing it on the table. He did not shout like Pike. He simply spoke, and the room fell silent. "Gentlemen," Silas began, "I represent the Eastern Union Mining Consortium. We do not deal in pans and shovels. We deal in industry." He signaled to his accountant, who unrolled a large map on the table. It was a map of the territory, but drawn with cold, straight lines that ignored the curves of the land. "I am prepared to invest $500,000 into Red Mesa immediately," Silas announced. A gasp went through the room. $500,000. It was a number so large it felt abstract. "We will build a railway spur directly to the mine heads," Silas continued, his finger tracing a line on the map. "We will construct a stamp mill here, capable of processing 50 tons of ore a day. Jobs for every able-bodied man. Wages paid in specie, not scrip. Prosperity for this town, the likes of which you have never seen." Cheers erupted. Men slapped each other on the back. Pike beamed, looking like a cat who had swallowed a canary. However, Silas raised a hand, cutting through the noise. "This investment relies on one condition. The copper veins here are nearing exhaustion. We all know this. The real value, the asset that justifies this expenditure, is the hydraulic mining operation we intend to establish in the northern sector." He tapped a spot on the map. The cheers died down. "The survey indicates a massive alluvial deposit in the canyon basin," Silas said. "We will need to divert the river, blast the canyon walls to widen access, and bring in the heavy dredgers." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Divert the river, blast the walls. They were talking about destroying the singing river. They were talking about erasing the sanctuary of the Shoshone. Before she could stop herself, her legs were moving. She pushed through the crowd of sweating bodies. "You cannot do that," a voice rang out. The room turned. Silas Caro stopped mid-sentence, his brow furrowing slightly. He looked down to see a thin woman in a faded calico dress standing near the front of the crowd. Her hands were shaking, but her chin was lifted. "Excuse me," Silas said, his tone polite but icy. "That land," Clara said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "The Northern Valley. It does not belong to Red Mesa. It is Shoshone territory. It is their winter ground. Their ancestors are buried in those caves. You cannot just walk in and blast it apart." Harlan Pike's face turned a violent shade of purple. He slammed his hand on the table. "Sit down, Boone." Pike roared. Nobody asked for the opinion of a washerwoman. "It is not an opinion," Clara insisted, looking directly at Silas. "It is a treaty right. If you touch that river, you declare war on the tribe." Silas looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. "Miss Boone," Pike sneered, stepping between them. "Ignore her. Mr. Caro. She is nobody. Just a local stray who thinks because she washes shirts she understands commerce." Pike turned to the crowd. Sensing their irritation at the interruption, he decided to crush her, to make her small so the business could proceed. He pointed a thick finger at her face. "Look at her," Pike shouted, his voice dripping with venom. "Always lurking around where she is not wanted. We are talking about the future of this town, and she is worried about some savages." He leaned in, his voice booming for everyone to hear. "Go back to your sewing. Clara, you are out of your depth. We all know why you spend so much time with the Indians. No white man would have you. Too plain, too ugly to marry, and too stupid to know business." The laughter hit her like a physical wave. It started with Pike's cronies and spread through the room. Men who she had served drinks to. Men whose children she had taught to read, they threw their heads back and guffawed. "Too plain, too ugly to marry." The words echoed off the wooden walls. Clara felt tears stinging the back of her eyes, hot and humiliating. She wanted to vanish. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Silas Caro did not laugh. He stood perfectly still, watching her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were cold. He saw the cruelty, yes, but he also saw a disruption to his timeline. He saw an emotional woman standing in the way of a railroad. "Mr. Pike is crude," Silas said calmly, his voice cutting through the laughter. "But his point regarding the ownership is valid. The government has granted my consortium the mineral rights." Clara bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. She reached into the pocket of her apron. "The government in Washington may have drawn a line on a map," Clara said, her voice low. "But the government did not sign this." She pulled out a piece of paper. It was old, creased 100 times, stained with tobacco and time. She walked forward and slammed it onto the table, right on top of Silas's pristine map. "Read it," she challenged. Silas looked at her, then at the paper. He picked it up with 2 fingers. The lawyer leaned in, squinting. "It is an agreement," the lawyer stammered, reading the faded ink. "Dated 1868, signed by Chief Two Moons of the Shoshone and Elias Boone." "My father," Clara said. "He saved the chief's grandson from a cougar. In return, the chief granted him the stewardship of the valley's resources. It says that no white man may break the earth there without the consent of Elias Boone or his heir. This is ridiculous." Pike sputtered. "That is a scrap of trash. It holds no water in a court." "Actually," the lawyer interrupted nervously, "it is witnessed by a federal marshal who was passing through at the time, and it is notarized. Under the Territorial Act of '72, Existing local agreements with indigenous leadership are complicated. We cannot simply ignore it. The room went dead silent. The plain girl was not just a nuisance. She was a legal wall. Silas looked up from the paper. For the first time, he really looked at Clara. He did not see beauty. Certainly, he saw a woman with dust on her hem and a face worn by worry. But he saw intelligence in her eyes. "You are the heir?" Silas asked. "I am," Clara said. "And I say no. No blasting. No river diversion." Pike looked like he was about to stroke out. "You little witch. You would starve this town for your sentimental rubbish." Suddenly, the batwing doors swung open. The silence in the room deepened, taking on a darker, more dangerous quality. Ravenhawk stood there. He was not alone this time. 6 warriors stood behind him, rifles held loosely but ready. They did not enter the saloon. They stood on the porch, framed by the sunlight, looking like spirits of vengeance. Ravenhawk locked eyes with Clara. He had heard. "Translate," Silas ordered Clara, his voice sharp. "Tell him I am a reasonable man. Tell him I offer $10,000 for the rights to the valley. That is more money than his people have ever seen." Clara turned to the door. She spoke in Shoshone, her voice clear. She relayed the offer. Ravenhawk did not blink. He looked past Clara, straight at the man in the fine suit. He spoke a single sentence in English, his voice rough like grinding stones. "We do not sell the river," Ravenhawk said. "We do not sell the bones of our fathers to the man who will dig their graves." Silas tightened his jaw. This was not going well. "Negotiation is always an option. Sir, refusal will only bring the army." "Let them come," Ravenhawk replied. Harlan Pike had heard enough. The humiliation of being silenced by a woman and an Indian in his own town was too much. "Get them out of here," Pike screamed at his hired thugs near the door. "Run these savages off and teach that Boone girl a lesson in manners." It happened in a blur. One of Pike's men, a brute with a scar across his nose, shoved a chair aside and lunged toward the door. Reaching for his pistol, Ravenhawk moved with impossible speed, stepping back and raising his rifle. "No!" Clara screamed. Pandemonium erupted. A bottle flew through the air, shattering against the mirror behind the bar. Men were shouting. Fists were flying. The table with the map was overturned. Clara was shoved violently to the side by a miner scrambling to get away. She stumbled, falling against the bar. Pike's man turned his rage on the easiest target. "You caused this," he roared, raising a heavy whiskey bottle high above his head, aiming straight for Clara. Clara flinched, raising her arms to protect her face, waiting for the shattering pain. It never came. A dark shape moved between her and the attacker. There was a sickening thud, a grunt of pain, and the sound of glass breaking against bone. Clara opened her eyes. Silas Caro was standing over her. He had stepped in. He had taken the blow meant for her. The bottle had smashed against his left shoulder, tearing the fine fabric of his coat. Dark blood began to seep through the gray wool instantly. The attacker froze, realizing he had just assaulted the man with the money. Silas did not crumble. He drew a pearl-handled revolver from inside his coat with his right hand smooth, practiced, deadly, and fired a single shot into the ceiling. Blam! The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Dust rained down from the rafters. The fighting stopped instantly. Men froze mid-punch. Silas stood there, his chest heaving slightly, his face pale from the shock of the blow to his shoulder. He leveled the gun in the room. "Enough," he said. His voice was not loud, but it was terrifyingly calm. "The next man who throws a punch will answer me, and I do not miss it." He looked down at Clara. She was huddled on the floor, looking up at him with wide, shocked eyes. For a moment, the world narrowed down to just the two of them. Silas saw her, up close, beneath the fear. He saw the arch of her brow, the depth of her amber eyes, the fierce intelligence he had dismissed earlier. He felt a strange jolt in his chest, part adrenaline, part something else. He had protected her. Why, he was a man who calculated risk, and saving a penniless spinster was a bad investment. Yet, his body had moved before his mind gave permission. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "No," Clara breathed. She saw the blood on his shoulder. You are bleeding." Silas glanced at his shoulder with disdain, as if the injury were a personal insult. "It is a scratch." He reached down with his good hand. Clara hesitated, then took it. His grip was firm, pulling her to her feet with surprising strength. For a second, they stood close. Clara could smell the aroma of bay rum and expensive tobacco, now mixed with the metallic tang of blood. She felt a confusing rush of gratitude and attraction, mixed with the shame of the insults hurled at her moments ago. But the moment broke as quickly as it had formed. Harlan Pike scrambled out from behind the overturned table. "Mr. Caro, my God, are you all right, these animals? I told you we need to arrest them all." Silas released Clara's hand abruptly. The mask of the Tycoon slammed back into place. He looked at the chaos, at the Shoshone warriors still watching from the door, and then at Clara. He adjusted his ruined coat, wincing slightly. "This meeting is adjourned," Silas announced coldly. He turned to his lawyer. "Get the doctor, then get the sheriff." He turned to Pike. "Mr. Pike, walk with me. It seems if we want to secure the valley, we will need to take more direct measures. I cannot do business with anarchists." Clara felt as if he had slapped her. "Mr. Caro?" she asked softly. Silas looked at her, and his eyes were once again walls of ice. The moment of protection was gone, replaced by the ruthlessness of the deal. "Miss Boone," he said, his voice devoid of warmth, "you have a piece of paper. I have the United States government and $500,000. Do not mistake a moment of chivalry for weakness. I suggest you sell that claim to me by tomorrow noon, or you will find yourself with nothing." He turned his back on her. "Come, Pike." Silas walked out, stepping over broken glass, leaving Clara standing alone in the wreckage of the saloon. Ravenhawk caught her eye from the doorway. His face was grim. He nodded once a silent message. "Now you see them." Then he and his men melted away into the street. Clara ran all the way back to the boarding house. She did not stop until she was inside her room with the door bolted. She leaned against the wood, gasping for air. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely undo the buttons of her apron. The events of the last hour swirled in her mind like a fever dream. The laughter, too plain, too ugly. The paper, the fight, and him, Silas Caro. She touched her hand where he had held it. She could still feel the warmth. Why had he stepped in? Why take a blow for her? But then she remembered his eyes at the end. "Do not mistake chivalry for weakness." He was just like the rest of them. Worse, maybe, because for 1 second, he had made her feel safe, only to tear the ground out from under her feet. She walked to the wash basin and splashed water on her face, trying to scrub away the shame. She looked up. The mirror was there. The crack ran right through her reflection, splitting her face in two. She stared at herself. "Too plain," she whispered. She saw the brown hair, dull in the dim light, the thin lips, the skin that was too dark from the sun. She grabbed the heavy ceramic pitcher on the washstand. A scream built in her throat, a scream of 10 years of loneliness, of being the joke of the town, of carrying the weight of a dead father's promise. She raised the pitcher, ready to smash the mirror into 1,000 pieces, to destroy the image that everyone despised. Her arm trembled. She held it there, poised to strike. Then she froze. In the mirror, she saw her eyes. They were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of the woman who had walked into a saloon and spoken to warriors. They were the eyes of the woman who held the legal claim to a mountain of gold. Silas Caro thought he could buy her. Harlan Pike thought he could shame her. Clara slowly lowered the pitcher. She set it down on the stand with a soft clink. "No," she said to the empty room. Her voice was steady now. "I am not ugly. I am the only thing standing between them and the valley." She walked to her trunk and took out the map again. She smoothed it out on the bed. If Silas Caro wanted a fight, he would get one. He wanted to do business, fine. She would show him the cost of doing business with Clara Boone outside. The wind howled, rattling the window pane. The storm had arrived, and in the distance, under the pale light of the moon, the singing river flowed on. Unaware that the wolves were gathering at the gate, the sun had not yet breached the eastern horizon, but the sky above Red Mesa was already bruising with the promise of heat, a deep violet bleeding into a sickly yellow. Inside the private carriage of the Union Pacific train, the air was stale, smelling of day-old cigars and the distinct, metallic scent of anxiety. Silas Caro sat in a velvet armchair, his left arm bound in a clean white sling. He was not looking at the sunrise. He was looking at Percival Thwaite, his attorney, who was sweating profusely despite the morning chill. "Say that again," Silas said. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually preceded a firing or a lawsuit. Thwaite swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his starch-stiffened collar. "I said, sir, the document is valid. I stayed up all night with the territorial statutes. The claim is not a standard mining stake. It is a stewardship contract. It predates the current zoning laws by 10 years and, crucially, it was countersigned by a federal marshal named Halloway. If we take this to court, we will be tied up in litigation for 5 years, maybe 10. Silas closed his eyes for a moment. 10 years. Yes, sir. And with the gold standard fluctuating as it is, the investors will pull out in 6 months if we do not break ground. Harlan Pike, who was pacing the narrow carriage like a caged bear, slammed his fist into his open palm. This is insanity. It is a scrap of paper held by a washerwoman and a savage, just pay the sheriff to lose the county records. Burn the boarding house down if you have to. Silas opened his eyes. They were cold, hard chips of flint. Sit down. Pike, we are businessmen, not arsonists. At least, I am. He stood up, wincing slightly as his bruised shoulder protested the movement. He walked to the window and looked out at the dusty town waking up. Somewhere in that grid of shacks and saloons was Clara Boone. "We cannot go around her," Silas murmured, half to himself. "So we must go through her, or rather, with her." "You cannot negotiate," Pike sputtered. "She made a fool of you." "She made a point. Mr. Pike," Silas corrected. "She has leverage, and leverage is the only thing I respect in an adversary." He turned back to the room. "Get the horses ready. We are going to make Miss Boone an offer she cannot refuse. Not money, validation." Clara was sweeping the porch of the boarding house when they arrived. She saw them coming from 2 blocks away, a procession of dust and expensive horseflesh. Silas rode at the front, sitting tall in the saddle despite his injury, flanked by Pike and 2 of his hired guns. She gripped the broom handle until her knuckles turned white. She had expected the sheriff. She had expected an eviction notice. She had not expected the Tycoon himself. Silas dismounted with a grace that surprised her. He handed the reins to a stable boy and walked up the steps. He removed his hat, revealing hair that was slightly matted from sweat. "Miss Boone," he said. "Mr. Caro," Clara replied. She did not curtsy. She stood her ground, the broom held like a staff. "If you have come to buy the paper, the answer is still no." "I have not come to buy it," Silas said. He looked at her, really looked at her, noting the dark circles under her amber eyes. "I have come to propose a partnership." Pike, still on his horse, snorted in derision but remained silent under a glare from Silas. "A partnership," Clara repeated, skepticism dripping from the word. "I need to see the valley," Silas said. "Not on a map, not from a distance. I need to stand in the water and see the rock strata. My geologist believes the vein runs deep, but until I verify it, I am fighting ghosts." He took a step closer. "Guide us there. Miss Boone, you and your friends, show me why this land is so sacred to you. If, after the survey, I decide the environmental cost is too high, I will walk away. I'll give you my word." Clara studied his face. It was a handsome face, sharp-jawed and clean-shaven, but there were lines of fatigue around his mouth that made him look human. "The word of a gold man is worth less than fool's gold," she said softly. "Perhaps," Silas conceded. "But that is all I have to offer. And if you refuse, Pike here will eventually find a way to bypass the law. If you guide us, you control the route. You control the pace. You protect your river." Clara looked past him, toward the distant peaks where the Shoshone camped. She knew he was right. Pike would burn the whole territory to get what he wanted. Silas Caro was dangerous, but he was rational. "I have conditions," Clara said. "Name them." "Ravenhawk comes with us, and Elder Grey Cloud. They know the spirits of the canyon, and no tools, no pickaxes, no dynamite, no shovels. We look with our eyes only. If anyone strikes the earth, the deal is off, and the tribe will defend the land." "Agreed," Silas said instantly. "And one more thing," Clara added, her voice hardening. "Mister, Pike stays behind." "Absolutely not," Pike roared from his saddle. "It is my town, my claim. It is my expedition," Silas said without looking back at him. Then he paused, calculating. "However, Mr. Pike represents the local labor force. He should see the difficulties of the terrain." He looked at Clara. "Let him come. If he falls off his horse, we will leave him there." Clara hesitated. She hated Pike, but she saw a flicker of amusement in Silas's eyes, a shared understanding that Pike was a nuisance to them both. "Fine," Clara said. "We leave in 1 hour. Tell your men to bring water. The high desert does not forgive mistakes." The journey began under a sky that was a blinding, relentless white. The heat rose from the ground in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon until the mountains looked like they were melting. The party was an uneasy alliance. At the front rode Ravenhawk on his massive black stallion, Nightwind. Next to him was Clara, riding a sturdy roan mare. Behind them, Elder Grey Cloud rode a mule, chanting softly to himself, ignoring the white men entirely. Silas Pike and 3 of Pike's men brought up the rear. They rode in silence for 3 hours, leaving the dusty streets of Red Mesa behind and entering the broken, jagged landscape of the foothills. The trail was narrow, winding up steep switchbacks of red sandstone. Clara kept her eyes forward, but she was acutely aware of Silas behind her. She expected him to complain. She expected him to flag in the heat, but every time she glanced back, he was there, sitting easy in the saddle, his eyes scanning the rock formations with an intensity that matched Ravenhawk's. "He rides well for a city man," Ravenhawk murmured in Shoshone, bringing his horse alongside hers. "He has money for lessons," Clara replied in the same tongue, though she felt a strange prickle of defense for the Tycoon. "Do not trust him, Raven." "I trust the snake to bite," Ravenhawk said. "I trust the wolf to hunt. I trust this man to want gold. It is honest nature." By mid-afternoon, the wind changed. It started as a low moan in the canyons, a sound like a dying breath. Then the sky to the west turned a bruised purple, and a wall of brown dust appeared on the horizon. It stretched from the earth to the heavens, blotting out the sun. "Haboob!" Clara shouted, turning her horse. "Sandstorm! We need cover!" "Push for the ridge," Ravenhawk commanded, pointing to a rock overhang 500 yards up the trail. The wind hit them a second later, a physical blow that nearly unseated Harlan Pike. The air turned into flying sandpaper. Visibility dropped to 0. The horses screamed, pinned ears flat against their skulls, dancing in panic. "Keep moving," Silas yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. The trail narrowed as it hugged the cliffside. To the left was a sheer drop of 200 feet into the dry riverbed below. Disaster struck quickly. One of Pike's men, a heavy-set brute named Grimes, lost control of his mount. The horse reared, terrified by the stinging sand, and its hind hooves slipped over the edge. "Help me!" Grimes screamed, sliding backward. Pike, who was closest, spurred his own horse forward, away from the danger, leaving his man to die. But Silas did not run. He wheeled his horse around, fighting the animal's panic. At the same moment, Ravenhawk saw the danger. The 2 men, the Tycoon and the warrior, moved as if they shared a single mind. Silas threw a rope, the lasso landing perfectly over the neck of Grimes's struggling horse. He wrapped the other end around his saddle horn. "Heave!" Silas roared. Ravenhawk leaped from his stallion, landing on the crumbling edge of the cliff. He grabbed the bridle of the falling horse, his moccasins digging into the loose shale. "Pull!" Ravenhawk shouted. Silas spurred his horse forward. The rope went taut. Veins bulged in Silas's neck. His injured shoulder must have been screaming in agony, but he did not let go. Ravenhawk used his immense strength to haul the horse's head around, guiding it back to solid ground. With a final scramble of hooves and a spray of rocks, the horse and Grimes were back on the trail, shaking and terrified. The group huddled under the overhang just as the worst of the storm swallowed the world. For an hour, they crouched in the semi-darkness of the dust. Clara sat near the back, wiping grit from her eyes. She watched Silas. He was leaning against the rock wall, clutching his left shoulder, his face pale and streaked with red dust. He looked nothing like the pristine figure who had stepped off the train. He caught her looking. He offered a tight, pained smile. "Your friend is strong," Silas shouted over the wind, nodding toward Ravenhawk. "He is," Clara shouted back. "And you did not run." "Bad for business to lose employees," Silas said, dismissing his heroism with a shrug. But Clara saw his hands trembling not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash. He was not just a suit. He was a man who held the line. The realization was dangerous. It made the wall she had built against him a little thinner. Night fell as the wind died down, leaving the air crisp and impossibly clear. The temperature plummeted, as it always did in the high desert. They made camp in a box canyon, the walls shielding them from the lingering gusts. A fire was built from dried mesquite wood. Its scent was sweet and sharp. They ate in shifts. Pike and his men sat on one side, drinking whiskey from a flask and muttering. The Shoshone elder sat by the fire, eyes closed. Clara, Silas, and Ravenhawk formed an uneasy triangle near the warmth. Because of the rough terrain, they had traveled light. Bedrolls were scarce. "The wind cuts like a knife tonight," Silas observed, rubbing his arms. He had given his heavy coat to the elder, a gesture that had stunned Clara into silence. Now he was shivering in his shirt sleeves. "You will freeze before morning," Clara said. She hesitated, then unfolded her heavy wool blanket. It was large, woven with Shoshone patterns. "It is big enough for two, if we stay close." Silas looked at her. In the firelight, the plainness Pike spoke of seemed to vanish. The flames cast shadows that accentuated her high cheekbones and the strength of her jaw. "I would not want to compromise your reputation, Miss Boone," Silas said softly. "My reputation was ruined the day I was born, according to this town," Clara replied, her voice dry. "Get under, unless you prefer to lose toes to frostbite." They sat side by side against a large boulder, the blanket pulled up to their chins. The proximity was overwhelming. Clara could feel the heat radiating from his arm, his thigh pressing lightly against hers. He smelled of wood smoke, sweat, and a faint, expensive soap that reminded her of cedar. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She kept her body stiff, terrified that if she relaxed, she would lean into him. She had never been this close to a man, not like this. Silas shifted, trying to get comfortable. His gaze fell on her neck, where her scarf had slipped. The skin there was pale, untouched by the sun, smooth as cream. He traced the line of her throat with his eyes. Too plain, he thought. They are blind. She had a quiet, austere beauty, like a church in the wilderness. "Tell me," Silas whispered, breaking the silence. "Why this valley? There are 100 canyons in Colorado. Why fight so hard for this one?" Across the fire, Ravenhawk looked up. He was whittling a piece of driftwood. "It is the vein of the world," Ravenhawk said. His voice carried across the fire, low and melodic. Silas looked at the warrior. "The gold vein?" "No," Ravenhawk said. "The life vein. The legend says that when the world was made, the Great Spirit wept for the beauty of the land. His tears became the river, but a demon tried to drink it dry. The spirit struck the demon down, and its greed turned into the gold dust at the bottom of the water." Ravenhawk paused, his knife carving a long strip of bark. "Gold is not a gift. White man. It is the solidified greed of a dead monster. Whoever disturbs it wakes the hunger. The river will rise and swallow them. Harlan Pike, listening from the shadows, let out a loud, braying laugh. Fairy tales. It is geology, you savage. Erosion and sedimentation, not demons. Ravenhawk did not look at Pike. He kept his eyes on Silas. Believe what you wish, but the river listens. Silas chuckled softly, a reflex of his scientific mind. It is a colorful story. But then he felt Clara stiffen beside him. He looked down. Her face was turned toward the fire, and there was a profound, aching sadness in her eyes. It was not fear of a ghost. It was fear of the loss of beauty. The laughter died in Silas's throat. He suddenly felt foolish for dismissing it. Hours later, the camp was silent. Pike and his men were snoring. The elder was asleep. Ravenhawk sat on a high rock, watching the darkness, a silent sentinel. Under the blanket, Clara was awake. She could feel the steady rise and fall of Silas's chest. "You are awake," Silas whispered. His voice was a rumble against her shoulder. "The ground is hard," Clara whispered back. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without the title. It sounded intimate, forbidden. "I must ask you, do you hate me?" Clara turned her head. Their faces were inches apart. She could see the silver flecks in his eyes. "I do not hate you," she said honestly. "I hate what you represent. I hate the hole you will leave in the earth. I am a businessman," Silas said defensively. "I build things, railways, mills. I bring civilization." "You bring noise," Clara countered. "And you leave dust." Silas sighed. He shifted, his hand brushing hers under the blanket. He did not pull away. "I grew up in a tenement in Boston. Clara, 6 of us in one room. We froze in the winter. My sister died of a cough because we could not afford coal." Clara went still. She had imagined him born in silk. "I swore I would never be cold again," Silas continued, his voice raw. "I swore I would build a fortress of gold so high that poverty could never climb over the walls. That is why I chase the metal. It is not greed. It is fear." It was a confession. He was stripping himself bare before her. Clara turned her hand over, weaving her fingers through his. It was a bold move, terrified and instinctive. "Fire warms you, Silas," she whispered. "Gold is cold. You can pile it to the sky, but it will never hug you back." Silas stared at her. He felt a crack in the foundation of his world. He leaned in, just an inch. His breath hitched. He wanted to kiss her. God, he wanted to kiss this strange, fierce, plain woman who saw right through him. But the moment was shattered by the snap of a twig. Silas pulled back. Clara withdrew her hand. From the shadows, Ravenhawk watched them. He saw the connection. He saw the spark. He said nothing, but his grip on his rifle tightened. Unbeknownst to them all, Harlan Pike was not asleep. He had crept away from the firelight, moving toward the canyon entrance. In his hand, he held a piece of white chalk. He marked a large X on the base of a sandstone pillar that supported the canyon wall. He grinned in the darkness, his teeth yellow and wolfish. "Demons and spirits," Pike muttered to himself. "Let us see how your spirits handle 50 pounds of dynamite." He slipped back into his bedroll, closing his eyes as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the peaks. The party slept, warm under their blankets, unaware that the fuse for their destruction had already been lit in the mind of a madman. And under the wool cover, Silas Caro lay awake, staring at the stars, feeling the ghost of Clara's hand in his, wondering for the first time in his life if he was chasing the wrong kind of treasure. The sun was high and merciless when the party finally crested the ridge that guarded the Shoshones' winter sanctuary. The journey had been grueling, a test of endurance that had stripped away the veneer of civilization from the men of Red Mesa. But as they looked down into the basin below, even Harlan Pike ceased his incessant grumbling. They had arrived at the place where the river sings. It was a cathedral built not by hands, but by time and water. The canyon walls rose 300 feet on either side, sheer cliffs of sandstone that glowed with a deep, vibrant, ochre, striped with veins of purple quartz. In the center of this red embrace flowed the river, not the muddy, sluggish trickle that passed near the town, but a vibrant, turquoise ribbon of snowmelt that ran clear and cold over a bed of smooth, white stones. "My God," Silas Caro whispered. He pulled his horse to a halt, his eyes wide. He had expected a muddy gulch. He had expected a dry creek bed where one had to sift through tons of dirt to find a speck of color. Instead, he saw a paradise. The vegetation was lush here, fed by the spray of the water cottonwoods with leaves of shimmering silver green, wild grasses that danced in the canyon breeze, and patches of wildflowers that defied the harsh desert climate. But it was the water itself that held his gaze. As the afternoon sun hit the river at a sharp angle, the bottom of the stream seemed to ignite. Gold. It was not in nuggets, but in dust and flakes, millions of them, settled in the eddies and the sandbars. The riverbed glittered as if the stars had fallen from the sky and drowned there. It was a sight that would make a poor man weep and a rich man mad. "Look at it," Harlan Pike hissed, his voice trembling with a lust that was almost obscene. "It is paved with it. We could shovel it out with our hats." Ravenhawk sat on his stallion, his face a mask of stone. He looked at the white men, seeing the hunger in their eyes. "You see the yellow dust," he said, his voice cutting through the awe. "We see the blood of the earth. Do not forget the agreement. No tools, no digging." Silas nodded slowly, though it took a visible effort to tear his eyes away from the water. "We look," he said, his voice rough. "Only look." They rode down a narrow goat path, the horses placing their hooves carefully on the loose shale. When they reached the valley floor, the air was cooler, sweet with the scent of pine and damp earth. The sound of the river was louder here, a constant, melodic rushing noise that echoed off the canyon walls, the singing that gave the place its name. Elder Gray Cloud dismounted and walked to the water's edge. He knelt and drank from his cupped hands, ignoring the gold that swirled around his fingers. Silas dismounted as well. He walked to the bank, his boots crunching on the pebble beach. He knelt, not to drink, but to peer into the depths. His geologist's mind began to race. This was an alluvial trap, a natural sluice box created by the geology of the canyon. For thousands of years, the river had been washing gold down from the high peaks and depositing it here. "The concentration is unprecedented," Silas murmured. "If we brought in a hydraulic monitor, if we washed that south bank—" "If you wash the bank," Clara said, stepping up beside him. "You kill the river. The silt will choke the fish. The water will turn to mud. The song stops." Silas looked up at her. In this light, reflected by the water, she looked fierce and protective, a guardian spirit of the place. He felt a twinge of guilt for the calculations running through his head. Behind them, the sound of metal clanking against stone shattered the peace. Harlan Pike had dismounted and, unable to help himself, had pulled a small prospector's pick from his saddlebag. He was scrambling toward a rock formation near the water, eyes manic. "Just a sample," Pike shouted. "I just need a sample to show the investors." He raised the pick. "Stop!" Clara screamed, but it was Ravenhawk who moved. He did not shout. He did not run. He launched the heavy wooden lance he carried not to kill, but to block. The spear flew through the air and embedded itself in the ground inches from Pike's boot, vibrating with the force of the impact. Pike yelped and scrambled back, dropping the pick. Ravenhawk stood 10 feet away, his Winchester rifle now leveled at Pike's chest. The hammer clicked back with a sound that was louder than the river. "Touch the earth with iron again," Ravenhawk said, "and you will stay in it forever." Pike's hired men went for their pistols. The Shoshone warriors who had been shadowing them from the cliffs suddenly appeared on the ridgeline, silhouettes against the sky, weapons drawn. "Stand down," Silas roared. He stepped between Ravenhawk and Pike, his arms raised. "Pike, you fool! I gave my word! Put the tool away or I will shoot you myself!" Pike looked at the spear, then at the warriors on the cliff, and finally at the cold rage in Silas's eyes. He spat on the ground, his face twisting in hatred. "You are siding with them again." "Caro," Pike snarled. "Against your own kind." I am siding with the contract, Silas said, his voice deadly calm. Get back to the horses. One more mistake, and you'll walk back to Red Mesa. The tension held for a long, agonizing minute. Then, slowly, Ravenhawk lowered his rifle. The warriors on the cliff vanished back into the rocks. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Her hands were trembling. This alliance was a spiderweb, fragile and ready to snap at the slightest breeze. By late afternoon, the group had set up a temporary camp a safe distance from the water. The mood was sullen. Pike and his men sat apart, whispering and casting dark glances at the river. Clara felt a desperate need to wash away the dust and the fear of the confrontation. She took a bundle of fresh clothes and a bar of soap, signaling to Ravenhawk that she was going downstream. He nodded, taking a position on a high rock where he could watch the approaches without intruding. She found a secluded inlet where the river widened into a calm pool, sheltered by a grove of willows and a towering wall of red rock. The water was ice cold, a shock to the system that made her gasp, but it felt cleansing. She washed her face, scrubbing until her skin tingled. Then she unpinned her hair. It fell in a heavy, wet curtain down her back, reaching her waist. She had removed her heavy outer dress and apron, wearing only her white chemise and a thin underskirt. It was improper, she knew, but here, in the solitude of the canyon, the rules of Red Mesa felt a million miles away. She sat on a flat, sun-warmed rock to dry her hair, combing her fingers through the tangles. The water looks cold. Clara jumped, clutching her chemise to her chest. Silas Caro was standing near the willows. He had removed his coat and vest. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the hollow of his throat. He looked less like a tycoon and more like a man who was weary of his own power. You should not be here, Clara said, her voice shaking. It is not decent. I apologize, Silas said, though he did not retreat. He stepped closer, his boots silent on the sand. I wanted to check the perimeter. I did not know you were occupied. He should have turned around. A gentleman would have turned around. But Silas found that he could not. He had spent the last 2 days watching her ride, watching her translate, watching her stand up to men twice her size. He had respected her, but now, seeing her like this wet hair clinging to her shoulders, the thin wet fabric of her chemise outlining the curve of her waist and the swell of her breast, he felt something far more dangerous than respect. He saw the scars on her arms, faint white lines from brambles and hard work. He saw the sun-darkened skin that the town ladies mocked. They say I am too plain, Clara whispered, seeing his gaze. The shame rose in her like bile. She tried to pull her wet hair forward to hide her face. Too ugly to marry, that is what you are thinking. Is it not, that I am a scarecrow? Silas stopped 3 feet from her. The sound of the river seemed to fade, leaving only the pounding of his own heart. Clara, he said softly. He reached out. His hand, usually so sure, trembled slightly. He touched a faint scar on her forearm, his fingers grazing the skin with agonizing slowness. Clara shivered, but she did not pull away. They are blind, Silas said, his voice dropping to a husk. They see only paint and powder. They do not see the fire. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever seen. You are not plain. You are elemental. He stepped into the space between them. Clara looked up, her amber eyes wide with disbelief and a sudden, terrifying hope. Silas, she breathed. He cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones. The heat of his palms was shocking against her cool, damp skin. I have never wanted anything in my life, Silas murmured, that I could not buy, until now. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was hungry, desperate, a collision of 2 lonely souls finding an anchor. Clara gasped against his mouth, and he took advantage. Deepening the kiss, his arms went around her waist, pulling her flush against him. She felt the hardness of his chest, the strength of him. For the first time in 28 years, she felt small, not in a way that diminished her, but in a way that made her feel held. She gripped his shoulders, her fingers digging into the fine linen of his shirt. The kiss went on, fueled by the adrenaline of the day and the raw beauty of the canyon. Silas backed her gently until she was pressed against the warm red rock of the cliff face. His hand moved to her waist, his fingers splaying over the damp fabric of her chemise, burning her skin through the cloth. Clara's head swam. She felt beautiful. For this one moment, she was not the spinster. She was desired. Silas pulled back slightly, resting his forehead against hers. Both of them were breathing heavily. "Clara," he whispered. "Don't speak," she said, her eyes closed, savoring the feeling of his breath on her lips. "Just let it be true for a moment." "It is true," Silas said. But then, his body tensed. He pulled away a fraction of an inch, and the cold air rushed into the space between them. "But I cannot lie to you," Silas said. The regret in his voice was a physical weight. "I cannot make promises I might not be able to keep." Clara opened her eyes. The warmth in her chest began to cool rapidly. "What do you mean?" Silas looked away, staring at the rushing water. "In Boston, there is an arrangement, a merger between my consortium and the grand banking house of the Vanderbilts. It was signed 2 years ago." Clara felt as if he had slapped her. She pushed him away, wrapping her arms around herself. "An arrangement, a marriage," Silas admitted, his voice heavy with shame. "To the daughter of the chairman. It is how business is done in the East. It secures the capital for the railroads." "For the mines." Clara stared at him. The beautiful moment shattered into 1,000 jagged shards. "So," she said, her voice trembling with a different kind of emotion, now humiliation. "You are betrothed, and yet you stand here, putting your hands on me. What am I?" "Silas. A curiosity. A way to pass the time in the wild before you go back to your porcelain doll." "No." Silas reached for her, but she stepped back, her back hitting the rock wall. "It is not like that. I do not love her. I have never even spoken to her for more than 5 minutes. It is a contract." "A contract," Clara repeated bitterly. "Everything is a contract to you. The land, the river, me." She felt foolish, stupid, too ugly to marry. Of course he was engaged to a wealthy beauty in the East. How could she have thought, even for a second, that the Gold King would want Clara Boone for anything more than a moment's pleasure? "You have the claim to the land," Clara said, her voice icy. "Do not think you can claim me too, just to make the deal sweeter." "Clara, please," Silas pleaded. "I am trying to tell you that I am trapped. Go," she ordered, pointing up the path. "Go back to your camp, Mr. Caro, before I forget that I promised not to let the warriors kill you." Silas stood there for a moment, looking at her with a mixture of longing and frustration. He wanted to explain, to tell her that he would break the engagement, that he would find a way, but he was a practical man, and he knew the power of the banks. He turned and walked away. His shoulders slumped, high above on the ridge, hidden in the shadows of a twisted juniper tree. Ravenhawk watched him go. He had seen it all, the touch, the kiss, the separation. He felt a dull, aching pain in his chest, a wound that no poultice could heal. He had loved Clara since the winter of the deep snow, but he was Shoshone, and she was white, and the world did not allow such things. He had stepped back to let her live her life. Seeing her in the arms of the gold man burned him, but seeing her push the man away, that gave him a grim satisfaction. "He is not worthy of the willow," Ravenhawk whispered to the wind. He shifted his rifle. He would not kill Silas Caro today, but if the man broke her heart again, the spirits might demand a sacrifice. Night fell over the canyon, heavy and suffocating. The clouds that had threatened rain all day finally broke. It started as a drizzle, then turned into a steady, drumming downpour. The camp was miserable. The fire hissed and sputtered, struggling against the wet wood. Harlan Pike did not sleep, while the others huddled under tarps. He signaled to his foreman, a man named Grimes, who had nearly fallen off the cliff earlier. "Is it done?" Pike whispered, wiping rain from his face. "Aye, boss," Grimes muttered, glancing nervously toward the Shoshone sentries who were invisible in the dark. "I stashed the crate in the lower cave, near the overhang. 100 sticks, dry and ready." "Good," Pike grinned, his teeth flashing in the lightning. "If Caro will not blast, nature will do it for us. We just need to help the erosion along. A little boom during the storm. They will think it was a lightning strike or a rock fall. And when the dam breaks, the gold washes out." "But the village," Grimes hesitated. "If the landslide is big enough, it will bury the Indian camp downstream." "Collateral damage," Pike spat. "Progress has a cost." He did not see the small shadow pressed against the rocks 10 feet away. It was Little Bear, a Shoshone boy of 12 summers who had been tasked by Ravenhawk to watch the horses. The boy's eyes went wide. He understood enough English to know what boom and bury meant. Little Bear turned and scrambled up the wet rocks, moving as silent as a lizard. He ran straight to Ravenhawk. 10 minutes later, the camp was thrown into chaos. Ravenhawk burst into the circle of light. Dragging Grimes by the collar of his coat, he threw the man into the mud at Silas's feet. "Traitor!" Ravenhawk roared. "Snake!" Silas jumped up, his hand going to his revolver. Clara emerged from her refuge, her face pale. "What is this?" Silas demanded. "Ask him," Ravenhawk shouted, pointing his knife at Pike. "The boy saw them. They have hidden fire sticks in the cave. Dynamite. They plan to bring the mountain down on my people." Silas turned to Pike. The Tycoon's face was terrible to behold. "Is this true?" Pike stood up, deciding to brazen it out. "We are here for gold. Caro, you are too soft to do what needs to be done. I am just securing the investment." Ravenhawk lunged. "I will cut his heart out." "No!" Clara threw herself in front of Ravenhawk. "Raven, stop if you kill him now. The army will come and wipe out the tribe. Think, he tried to kill my village." Ravenhawk snarled, his muscles vibrating with restraint. "Silas," Clara screamed, turning to the Tycoon. "Do something, you are the boss here." Silas looked at Pike. He looked at the dynamite that Grimes had confessed to hiding. This was criminal. It was attempted murder. But Silas Caro was a man who thought in chess moves. If he arrested Pike here, Pike's men would fight. There would be a shootout. People would die, perhaps Clara. And Pike held the contracts for the local labor. Without Pike, the mine would never open. "Tie them up," Silas ordered his men, pointing at Pike and Grimes. "Tie us up," Pike laughed. "You need me, Caro." "I said tie them up," Silas yelled. "We will take them back to town and deal with this legally." Clara stared at Silas. "Legally, he tried to commit mass murder. You should send him away now. You should break the contract with him." "I cannot just. It is complicated." "Clara," Silas said, running a hand through his wet hair, "I need to control the situation. If I cut him loose now, he returns to town and rallies a mob before we even get back. You are keeping him close because you still think you might need him," Clara said, her voice flat with disappointment. "You are weighing the gold against the lives of the Shoshone." Silas did not answer. He could not look her in the eye. "I was right," Clara whispered, stepping back into the rain. "The contract is all that matters to you." The rain intensified. The river began to roar, rising inch by inch, turning from a clear song into a muddy, violent growl. Word traveled fast on the frontier, faster than telegraph wires. Back in Red Mesa, rumors of the river paved with gold had leaked. Men were packing mules. Desperados were checking their guns. In the valley, the trap was set. The dynamite was still in the cave, unlit but deadly. The river was rising. The emotional dam between Clara and Silas had burst, leaving them on opposite sides of a moral chasm. Silas sat by the dying fire, watching Pike, who was bound but smirking and felt the weight of his choices crushing him. He looked toward Clara's tent, but there was no movement. He had kissed her. He had felt the truth about her. And then he had retreated behind his wall of money and obligations. High above, on the wet cliffs, the first rocks began to slide. The storm was not just in the sky. It was here, among them, and it was about to tear the world apart. The gray light of dawn bled over the eastern ridges of the mountains, casting long, skeletal shadows across the scrubland. The air was cold and smelled of wet sagebrush and impending violence. Silas Carroll rode his horse as if the devil himself were snapping at the animal's heels. His fine coat was gone, discarded hours ago in Red Mesa. His white shirt was stained with sweat and dust, and his left arm throbbed in its sling. But he did not slow down. He had made a mistake, a catastrophic, arrogant mistake. He had dragged Harlan Pike and the foreman, Grimes, back to town in the middle of the night, believing in the structure of law. He had locked them in the back room of the sheriff's office, intending to wire for a federal marshal at first light. But Silas had underestimated the rot in Red Mesa. The sheriff was not just fat and blind, as Ravenhawk had said. He was bought and paid for. Before the sun had even hinted at rising, the cell was open, and Pike was gone. And he had not gone alone. Word had spread through the saloons like a fever. The gold is there. The Eastern Tycoon and the Indians are trying to hoard it. Pike had rallied a mob. Not miners looking for a wage, but desperate, armed men looking for a fortune. They had ridden out an hour before Silas could gather his own horse. They were heading for the valley with shovels, rifles, and crates of stolen dynamite. Faster, Silas urged his horse, leaning low over the mane. Do not let me be too late. In the valley, the silence of the morning was shattered not by birdsong, but by the sound of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. Little Bear, the Shoshone scout, slid down the scree slope, his chest heaving. He ran straight to where Ravenhawk stood by the dying embers of the watchfire. They come, the boy gasped in his native tongue. Many men. They have fire sticks. Clara Boone emerged from her tent. She had not slept. She wore her riding skirt and a heavy canvas jacket she had borrowed from one of the men. Her hair was braided tight against her head, practical and severe. How many? Clara asked. 30, Little Bear replied. Maybe 40. Pike leads them. Ravenhawk's face hardened into a mask of war. He turned to his warriors. There were only 12 of them. The rest of the hunting party was days away in the northern ranges. We hold the pass, Ravenhawk commanded. If they cross the river, they will blast the walls. No, Clara said sharply. She ran to her saddlebag and pulled out the map the deer hide her father had left her. She spread it on a flat rock. Raven, look, the fault line runs here, behind the needle rock. If they blast near the water to open the vein, the vibration will trigger a slide here. She traced a line with her finger that cut across the narrowest part of the canyon floor, directly above the ancient caves where the Shoshone elders were sheltering, and where the women and children of the local band were hiding. It will not just open the mine, Clara said, her voice trembling with the weight of the knowledge. It will bury the village. It will wipe them out. Ravenhawk stared at the map. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Then we do not just hold the pass, we must stop them from lighting a single fuse. Clara looked toward the town road. I sent word to the blacksmith and the grocer last night, the men who owe my father. They might come. Farmers and shopkeepers against gunmen. Ravenhawk grunted. It is a bad day to die. Sugwa. It is a good day to fight, Clara corrected him. She picked up a Winchester rifle. She had never fired one at a man. But today, everything was different. The confrontation happened at the river's edge, where the water ran shallow over the glittering sands. Harlan Pike sat on his horse, surrounded by a ragged army of men who smelled of whiskey and greed. They held shotguns, old army revolvers, and pickaxes. 2 mules were laden with wooden crates marked Danger. Opposite them, forming a thin line across the pebble beach, stood Ravenhawk, his 12 warriors, and Clara Boone. Behind them, a handful of townsfolk, the blacksmith with his heavy hammer. The grocer with a bird gun looked terrified, but stood their ground. Get out of the way! Boone! Pike shouted. His face was swollen from where Ravenhawk had struck him the day before, and his eyes were manic. The law's gone. This is free land now. It is death! Clara shouted back, her voice ringing off the canyon walls. Pike, listen to me. The rock here is unstable. If you blast, you will bring the mountain down on your own heads. Lies, Pike screamed. You just want to keep it for yourself and your savage lover." He turned to his men. "You see the gold in the water? It is right there. All we have to do is blow that overhang and dam the flow, and we can pick it up with our bare hands." A roar of approval went up from the mob. They surged forward. "Hold!" Clara stepped forward, raising her rifle. Her hands shook, but her aim was true. "The first man who touches a fuse gets a bullet." Pike laughed. It was a cruel, barking sound. He looked at her with pure contempt. "Look at you," he sneered. "Playing soldier. Who gave you the right to give orders? A dried-up spinster, a woman who serves drinks and scrubs floors." He rode closer, confident she would not shoot. "Too plain, too ugly to marry," Pike quoted, spitting on the ground. "And now, I'm too stupid to know when to run. Get back to your kitchen, girl, before you get hurt." The insult landed. It was the same weapon he had used 100 times. For a second, Clara felt the old shame curl in her stomach. She felt small. She felt ugly. But then she looked at the river. She saw the water that sang. She looked at Ravenhawk, who stood ready to die for this place. She did not lower the rifle. She cocked the hammer. "I am not a spinster today. Harlan," Clara said, her voice dropping to a tone of cold iron. "I am the guardian of the claim, and you are trespassing. Kill them," Pike shrieked. "Stop!" The shout thundered from the ridge above. Every head turned. Silas Caro plunged his horse down the steep scree slope, sliding in a cloud of dust and rocks. He hit the valley floor and galloped between the two lines, reining his horse in so hard it reared, its hooves pawing the air. He looked magnificent and terrifying. His eyes were wild, his hair plastered to his forehead. "I said stand down," Silas roared. He turned his horse to face the mob. "I am Silas Caro. I own the Union Pacific Spur. I own the banknotes on half your homes. Go home, all of you. There is no gold here that is worth your lives." For a second, the authority of money held sway. The miners wavered. They knew the power of the Caro name, but Harlan Pike was past the point of reason. He saw his dream slipping away. He saw the Tycoon siding with the enemy again. "He lies," Pike shouted. "He wants it all for himself. He is sleeping with the Indian lover. Look at him. He is one man, we are 40, who is going to stop us, the rich boy." Pike pulled his revolver and fired. He did not aim at Silas. He aimed at the crate of dynamite strapped to the mule closest to the water. "No!" Silas screamed. The bullet missed the crate but struck the mule in the flank. The animal screamed and bucked, throwing the crate onto the rocks. The wood shattered. The sticks of dynamite spilled out. One of the miners, panicked by the gunshot, fired his shotgun blindly. The sparks from the muzzle blast hit the spilled powder. The world turned white. The explosion was not a sound. It was a physical force. It picked Clara up and threw her backward into the sand. It shattered the eardrums of everyone in the canyon. A massive plume of water, rock, and mud shot 200 feet into the air. Then came the rumble, a deep, grinding groan from the earth itself. "The wall!" Ravenhawk shouted, his voice barely audible over the ringing. "It falls!" The blast had cracked the integrity of the sandstone cliff face. A massive slab of rock, weighing tons, began to detach itself directly above where the Shoshone warriors stood. "Run!" Silas yelled, leaping from his horse. The firefight erupted in earnest. Pike's men, confused and terrified by the explosion, started shooting at anything that moved. The Shoshone returned fire with deadly precision. Ravenhawk lunged forward to pull a young warrior out of the path of the falling debris. A bullet from Pike's line caught him in the shoulder. The impact spun him around, and he fell hard near the water's edge, the river already rising rapidly from the debris, damming the flow. "Raven!" Clara scrambled to her feet. Ignoring the dirt and blood on her face, she ran through the crossfire. Bullets kicked up sand around her boots. She reached Ravenhawk just as the water began to lap at his face. She grabbed his good arm and hauled him up, dragging him behind the cover of a large boulder. "My arm?" Ravenhawk gasped, his face gray with pain. He tried to lift his rifle, but his fingers would not close. I cannot command." He looked at Clara. The warriors were scattered, pinned down, looking for a leader. "The river rises," Ravenhawk rasped. "Guide them. Willow, speak for the land." Clara looked at him. Then she looked at the chaos. Silas was pinned down near the mule carcass. The townsfolk were retreating. Pike was screaming orders to advance. Fear vanished. In its place was a cold, crystalline clarity. Clara stood up. She did not hide. She climbed onto the top of the boulder, exposing herself to the field. "Atuna Quint!" she screamed in Shoshone. "Move to the high ground. Flank them on the left." The warriors heard the voice of the woman who spoke their tongue. They obeyed instantly, moving like ghosts into the rocks on the left, gaining the high ground. "Miller Johnson!" Clara shouted in English, pointing at the blacksmith. "The water is damming up. Use the pry bars. Clear the debris, or we all drown. Cover them." Her voice cut through the panic. It was not the voice of a plain girl. It was the voice of a commander. Silas, firing his revolver from behind a dead horse, looked up and saw her. She stood amidst the smoke, hair wild, directing the battle with a ferocity that took his breath away. She was magnificent. The tide of the battle turned. The Shoshone, now on the high ground, rained fire down on Pike's exposed men. The miners, realizing they were outmaneuvered and that the valley was collapsing around them, broke ranks. "Retreat, run!" The cry went up. Harlan Pike did not run. He saw his army fleeing. He saw the gold being buried by the landslide. He saw Clara Boone standing on the rock like a queen. With a howl of rage, Pike charged toward the rock, climbing over the debris, a knife in his hand. He intended to slit her throat. Silas saw him. He abandoned his cover. He sprinted across the open ground, ignoring the falling rocks. Just as Pike reached the base of Clara's boulder, Silas tackled him. The two men crashed into the rising water. It was a brutal, ugly fight. No skill, just desperation. Pike gouged at Silas's eyes. Silas slammed his fist into Pike's jaw. They rolled in the mud, the water churning around them, turning red with blood. Pike was heavier, fueled by madness. He got his hands around Silas's throat, squeezing, forcing Silas's head under the water. Silas thrashed, his lungs burning. His injured arm was useless. His vision began to tunnel. Then, Pike's head snapped back. Clara had leaped from the rock, landing on Pike's back, smashing the butt of her rifle into his skull. Pike roared and threw her off. She landed hard in the mud, but the distraction gave Silas the second he needed. He surged up, gasping for air, and drove his shoulder into Pike's chest, driving him backward toward the cliff edge where the ground had shone away. Pike's boots slipped on the wet shale. He flailed, grabbing for purchase. He went over the edge. His hand caught a protruding root. He dangled there, 50 feet above the jagged rocks of the lower canyon. Silas stood over him, chest heaving, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. He looked down at the man who had caused all this. "Help me!" Pike screamed, his eyes bulging. "Caro, don't let me drop. I will give you the deed. I will give you everything." Silas looked at Pike's hand slipping on the root. "It would be so easy. Just wait. Just let gravity do the work. It would be justice." Silas raised his boot, poised to stomp on the root and end it. "Silas, no!" The scream pierced the red haze of his rage. Clara scrambled through the mud. She grabbed Silas's arm. "Do not do it!" she cried. "He tried to kill you!" Silas snarled, his voice unrecognizable. "He is a monster!" "Then do not become him!" Clara shouted, gripping his face with her muddy hands, forcing him to look at her. "If you drop him, you are just another murderer in the valley. You are better than that. Show this place that you are better." Silas froze. He looked at Clara's eyes amber, pleading, terrified for his soul, not for Pike's life. He let out a shuddering breath. He lowered his boot. He reached down, grabbed Pike's wrist with his good hand, and hauled the heavy man up over the lip of the cliff. Pike collapsed on the solid ground, retching and sobbing. Silas did not look at him. He signaled to the blacksmith, who had rushed forward with a length of rope. "Truss him up, tight, and if he speaks, gag him." The battle was over. The dust began to settle. The silence returned, heavy and ringing. The Shoshone warriors descended from the rocks. They did not cheer. They began to tend to the wounded. The river, though choked with debris, was finding a new path, flowing around the rockfall, muddy but alive. Clara stood in the middle of the devastation. Her jacket was torn. Her face was streaked with mud and soot. Her hands were covered in Ravenhawk's blood. She was shaking now, the adrenaline fading, leaving her knees weak. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, looking at the ruin of the beautiful valley. Silas walked toward her. He was a wreck. His trousers were shredded, his expensive boots ruined. His face was battered, one eye swelling shut. He limped slightly. The survivors' miners, townsfolk, warriors stopped what they were doing. They watched the Gold King approach the washerwoman. Silas stopped 3 feet from her. He looked at the destruction around them. Then he looked at her. He did not say a word. He simply lowered himself. He winced as his knee hit the sharp stones of the riverbed. But he did not falter. He knelt there, in the mud, in the blood, in the wreckage of his own ambition. Clara stared at him, her mouth falling open. "Silas," she whispered, "you are hurt. Stand up." Silas shook his head. He reached out and took her hand. His hand was trembling, stained with earth. "I was a fool," he rasped. His voice was rough from the smoke. "I looked at this land and saw a ledger. I looked at you and saw a transaction." He squeezed her hand. "Pike said you were too plain," Silas said, his voice gaining strength, carrying across the silent canyon. "He said you were too ugly to marry." He looked up at her, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes broke her heart. They were wrong. God, they were so wrong. "You are too rare. You are too brave not to marry. You are the fire that saved us." Clara felt tears cut hot tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "Clara Boone," Silas said, "marry me, not to own this valley, not to secure a contract. Marry me so we can guard it together. Marry me because I do not want to live another day in a world where you are not by my side." A gasp went through the gathered crowd. The townsfolk stared. This was Silas Caro, the man who could buy the state, kneeling in the dirt before the woman they had mocked for 10 years. Clara stood frozen. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Silas, this man who had fought for her, who had spared his enemy for her, who saw her. Then she looked past him. She saw Ravenhawk sitting against a rock, a bandage pressed to his shoulder. He was watching them. His face was unreadable, but he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. She looked at the river. It was still flowing. It was wounded, but it sang. Clara looked back down at Silas. "Get up, Silas," she said softly. Silas's face fell. He started to rise, thinking he had been rejected. "No," she said, tightening her grip on his hand to help him stand. "I did not say no." She reached up and wiped a smear of blood from his cheek. "But look around you," Clara said, her voice steady. "The valley is bleeding. The village is in danger. We have wounds to tend to. We have a river to clear." She met his eyes with a gaze that was equal parts love and steel. "The answer will come," she promised. "But not now. Not while there is work to do. If you want to be a guardian, Mr. Caro, then pick up a shovel. We save the land first." Silas stared at her for a long moment. Then, a smile broke through the grime on his face. It was not the smile of a tycoon. It was the smile of a man who had finally found something worth more than gold. "Yes, ma'am," Silas said. He turned, not to his horse, but to the pile of debris blocking the water. He picked up a fallen branch and began to dig. Clara watched him for a second, her heart swelling with a feeling she had never known. Then, she turned to the blacksmith. Mr. Miller," she corrected herself, seeing the town doctor arrive on a mule. "Check Ravenhawk's shoulder. The rest of you, form a line. We move the rocks one by one." The sun rose higher over the broken valley, shining on the gold dust that swirled unnoticed in the water, and on the men and women who had turned their backs on it to save each other. The dust had settled over Red Mesa, but the air still tasted of grit and judgment. It was 3 days after the explosion in the Singing River Valley, and the town felt different. The chaotic, lawless energy that had fueled the gold fever was gone, replaced by a somber, almost religious gravity. Harlan Pike was brought back to town not as a conqueror, but draped over the back of a mule, his hands bound with rough hemp rope. His foreman, Grimes, walked beside him, limping and defeated. The trial, if one could call it that, was held in the open air, on the dusty patch of ground between the saloon and the small, whitewashed church. It was a symbolic location, standing halfway between vice and salvation. A makeshift tribunal had been assembled. It consisted of the sheriff, who had been shamed into sobriety by the events of the valley, Elder Gray Cloud, who sat on a wooden crate wrapped in a blanket of red and black wool, and Dr. Miller, the blacksmith-turned-physician who commanded the respect of the working men. Clara Boone stood to the right, her posture straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She wore a clean dress, the color of sage, and though her face still bore the faint scratches from the rockfall, she looked regal. Silas Caro stood to the left. His arm was back in a fresh sling, and a strip of white linen bandaged his forehead. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear, stripping away the arrogance that had defined his arrival. "This is a kangaroo court," Harlan Pike spat, though his voice lacked its usual thunder. He struggled against his bonds. "You cannot try me. I am the mayor of this town. In all but name, I demand a federal judge." "You will get a federal judge, Harlan," Silas said, his voice cutting through the morning heat like a razor. "But first, this town needs to hear the truth. The sheriff needs to write the report." Silas stepped forward, addressing the crowd of miners, shopkeepers, and wives who had gathered. "This man," Silas gestured to Pike, "attempted to use explosives on unstable land, knowing full well it would endanger the lives of the Shoshone village and the men under his own command. He fired a weapon at a crate of dynamite. He is not a businessman. He is an arsonist and an attempted murderer." The crowd murmured. The reality of the near-death experience in the canyon had sobered them. They had seen the rock fall. They knew how close they had come to being buried. "And," Clara added, her voice projecting clearly without a tremor, "he violated the Territorial Treaty of 1868. He trespassed on protected land with intent to destroy." Witnesses were called. The grocer spoke of Pike buying the dynamite off the books. The young Shoshone scout, translated by Clara, pointed a shaking finger at Grimes and described the planting of the explosives. When it was over, there was no gavel to bang. There was just the heavy silence of a community turning its back on a tyrant. "Harlan Pike," the sheriff said, clearing his throat and looking everywhere but at the prisoner's eyes, "I am remanding you to custody until the U.S. Marshal arrives from Denver. You are stripped of your mining claims pending federal investigation. You will regret this," Pike screamed as he was dragged toward the jailhouse, his boots dragging in the red dust. "Caro, you are throwing away millions. You are a traitor to your race." Silas did not flinch. He waited until the door of the jailhouse slammed shut. Then he turned to the crowd. "I am dissolving the Eastern Union's partnership with Pike Mining Enterprises effective immediately," Silas announced. "And I want to make one thing clear. I came here looking for gold at any cost. I was wrong." He looked at Clara. A softness entered his eyes that the town had never seen. "There is no profit worth the price of blood. From this day forward, Caro Industries operates under a new mandate. If we cannot mine with honor, we do not mine at all." A few men clapped, then more. It was not a raucous cheer, but a steady, rhythmic applause of approval. The real work began the next afternoon in the back room of the Mercantile, which had been converted into a neutral meeting ground. The table was covered with maps, not the cold. Straight-lined maps of the surveyors, but new charts drawn by Clara and Ravenhawk. Silas sat on one side, flanked by his nervous lawyer, Percival Thwaite. On the other side sat Elder Gray Cloud and Ravenhawk. Clara sat at the head of the table, the bridge between the two worlds. "The proposal is simple," Clara said, sliding a document across the rough wood. She had written it herself the night before, her hand steady despite her exhaustion. Section 1, she read. The Northern Valley, known as the place where the river sings, remains the sovereign territory of the Shoshone. No heavy machinery, no hydraulic monitors, no explosives. Thwaite, the lawyer, adjusted his spectacles nervously. Mr. Caro, this renders the site nearly commercially unviable. Without hydraulics. Read Section 2, Silas interrupted quietly. Clara continued. Section 2, a designated zone of 3 acres, downstream from the sacred caves, is granted for panning and sluicing only. This method is slower, but it preserves the riverbed. And the split, Ravenhawk asked, his voice low. He sat with his wounded arm resting on the table, his dark eyes fixed on Silas. 30% to the tribe for the lease of the land, Clara said. 30% to the town of Red Mesa, to build a school, a hospital, and maintain the roads. 40% to Caro Industries to cover logistics and transport. 40%, Thwaite sputtered. Sir, the standard investor's share is 80%. We take all the risk. We take no risk, Silas corrected him. The gold is sitting there. We just have to pick it up slowly. 40% of a fortune is still a fortune. Percival? Silas looked at Ravenhawk. But I have a condition. Ravenhawk raised an eyebrow. I want Clara Boone listed as a co-signatory on the deed, Silas said. And she receives half of my company's share. She is the one who saved the claim. It belongs to her as much as it does to me. Clara looked up, startled. Silas, I did not ask for that. I know, Silas said. That is why you deserve it. Ravenhawk looked between them. He saw the way Silas looked at Clara with a reverence that went beyond desire. He nodded slowly. The Shoshone agreed, Ravenhawk said. But know this, Goldman. If one stick of dynamite is found in that valley again, the deal is broken, and next time, I will not aim for the shoulder. Understood, Silas said solemnly. They signed the document. Silas used his gold fountain pen. Ravenhawk made his mark with charcoal. Clara signed her name in a neat, looping script. It was done. A peace treaty written in ink and honor. But peace is rarely without a price. 2 days later, the euphoria of the agreement was shattered by the arrival of the mail coach. Percival Thwaite came to Silas's room at the hotel, his face pale as a sheet. Sir, Thwaite whispered, closing the door behind him. A telegram from New York, and a letter from Mr. Vanderbilt. Silas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He took the letter. The stationery was thick, heavy cream paper that smelled of old money and threats. He read it. His face went gray. What does it say? Thwaite asked, though he clearly knew. He knows about the delay, Silas said, his voice hollow. He has heard rumors that I am going native and wasting capital. He says if I do not return to New York within the month to finalize the merger and the marriage to his daughter, Beatrice he will call. In the loans for the Western expansion, Thwaite asked. All of them, Silas said. The loans my father took out before he died. The loans that built the railways. If he calls them in. Caro Industries is bankrupt. I will be destitute. And worse, thousands of men who work for me across the country will lose their jobs. Silas walked to the window. He looked out at the street where Clara was walking, carrying a basket of apples. She looked happy, for the first time in years. She looked light. He had promised to marry Beatrice Vanderbilt. It was a loveless arrangement, a business merger disguised as a wedding. He had made that promise to save his father's legacy. Sir, Thwaite said softly, you know what you must do. You cannot marry a washerwoman in Colorado and bankrupt an empire. The board will crucify you. Silas gripped the window frame until his knuckles turned white. He was trapped. To choose Clara was to choose ruin, not just for himself, but for everyone who depended on his company. Clara found out the way people always found out bad news in small towns, through the whispers of those who thought they were invisible. She was delivering a shirt to the hotel clerk when she heard Thwaite arguing with the telegraph operator in the lobby. Send it again, Thwaite was hissing. Tell Vanderbilt that Mr. Caro is returning. Tell him the engagement stands. We just need 2 weeks. Clara froze. The shirt slipped from her hands onto the dusty floor. The engagement stands. The words echoed in her head, mingling with the memory of Silas kneeling in the mud. Marry me, he had said, not to own this valley but to guard it. Had it been a lie or just a fantasy, she did not cry. She was done crying over men who saw her as an option. She picked up the shirt, dusted it off, and walked straight up the stairs to room 204. She did not knock. She opened the door. Silas was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. The letter lay on the floor. He looked up, and the misery in his face told her everything. "Clara," he started, standing up. "Do not," she said, raising a hand. Her voice was not angry, but it was incredibly sad. "I heard from your lawyer. You are going back. I have to," Silas said, his voice cracking. "Clara, listen to me. It is not what you think. It is the debt. My father's debt. If I do not honor the contract with Vanderbilt, they will destroy everything. The company, the jobs of 3,000 men, even the capital for the agreement we just signed for the valley." He took a step toward her. "I can fix it. I just need time. I will go back. I will negotiate a buyout. You will go back and marry her," Clara said. "Because that is what men like you do. Silas, you have responsibilities that are bigger than your heart." She walked over to him. She did not slap him. She reached up and touched the bandage on his forehead. "I am not mine. Silas," she whispered. "I am not a valley you can come back to when the other one runs dry. I am not a contingency plan." "You are my life," Silas said fiercely, grabbing her hand. "I love you. I have never said that to a woman. I love you." "Then be free," Clara said. She pulled her hand away gently. "Go back to the east. Pay your debts. Save your company. But do not come back to me until you are Silas Caro. The man. Not Silas Caro. The Tycoon. Not Silas Caro. The fiancé of Beatrice Vanderbilt. Clara, if you come back to me while you are still bound to another, I will not be here," she said. Her amber eyes were dry and clear. "I waited 10 years to be seen. Silas, I will not wait one day to be a mistress." She turned and walked to the door. "Goodbye, Silas." She closed the door. Silas stood in the silence, the scent of her lavender soap lingering in the air, feeling as if his heart had been ripped out of his chest. The next morning, Silas Caro made the first reckless decision of his life, or perhaps the first sane one. He walked into the telegraph office. He pushed Thwaite aside. "Take a dictation," Silas told the operator. "To whom, sir?" "To Cornelius Vanderbilt, New York City." Silas took a deep breath. "Message reads, regret to inform you that the engagement between myself and your daughter is terminated effective immediately. Stop. Regarding the loans, I am liquidating my personal assets to satisfy the debt in full. Stop. Caro Industries will stand independent or it will fall. Stop. I choose freedom." Thwaite gasped. "Sir, you cannot. You are selling the Pennsylvania Steel shares, the shipping lines." "Sell it all," Silas said, his voice steady. "Sell the mansion on Fifth Avenue. Sell the horses. Sell everything until the debt is paid to the last cent. You will be, well, not poor, but significantly diminished." Thwaite stammered. "You will lose your seat on the exchange." "I do not care about the seat," Silas said. He looked out the window toward the mountains. "I have found a better view." He turned to the operator. "Send it." He knew he could not go to Clara yet. He had to go east. He had to face the fire, sign the papers, and dismantle his own golden cage. He had to prove not to her, but to himself that he was worthy of the woman who had saved him. He boarded the train an hour later. He did not look for Clara. He knew she was watching. He would return when he was clean. That evening, as the train's whistle faded into the east, Ravenhawk found Clara sitting on the roof of the boarding house, watching the smoke trail disappear. "He is gone," Ravenhawk said. "He went to do what is right," Clara said, though her voice felt fragile. "Come," Ravenhawk said. "The horses are ready." He took her riding. They rode out of town, past the scarred earth of the old mines, up to the ridge that overlooked the Singing River Valley. The sun was setting. painting the sky in riots of orange and violet. The valley was healing. The water ran clear again. The scar of the landslide was visible, but green shoots were already pushing through the mud. They dismounted and stood on the edge of the world. "I used to think," Ravenhawk said, staring at the horizon, "that the spirits brought you to me so I could keep you, that you were the willow planted by my river." Clara looked at him. His face was stoic, but his eyes held a deep, ancient sadness. "Raven." "But a willow does not grow in the shadow of a hawk," he continued gently. "You have grown strong. Sugwa, you stood before the gun. You commanded the battle. You are not the girl I pulled from the snow anymore." He turned to face her. He reached out and touched her braid, a gesture of farewell to a dream he had held for 10 years. "You walk between worlds now," Ravenhawk said. "You are of the town, and you are of the tribe, but your heart has followed the iron horse." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I tried not to love him. Raven, I tried." "The heart is a wild horse," Ravenhawk said with a faint, crooked smile. "You cannot break it. You can only ride it." He took a step back. "He is a good man," Ravenhawk admitted, the words costing him something. "He broke his own power to save a man who hated him. He knelt in the mud for you. If he returns, tell him the Shoshone will not shoot him." Clara laughed, a watery, choked sound. "I will tell him." "But if he makes you cry again," Ravenhawk added, his hand drifting to his knife, "I will scalp him. That is a promise." "Suvade, Ravenhawk," Clara whispered. "It is finished. It is good." "Suvade, Clara Boone," he replied. He mounted Night Wind and turned the stallion toward the high peaks. He did not look back. He rode into the sunset, a silhouette of the Old West, fading into the landscape that he loved more than any woman. Clara stood alone on the ridge. She touched the pocket of her dress where the copy of the treaty lay. She was alone again. The town still whispered. The future was uncertain. Silas might lose everything and never return. But as she looked at the vast, open sky, Clara realized something profound. She did not feel plain. She did not feel ugly. She felt like the land itself, enduring, wild, and waiting for the spring. She mounted her horse and turned back toward Red Mesa. She had a school to teach. She had a town to rebuild. And she had a love worth waiting for. The seasons in the Colorado Territory did not turn gently. They broke and rebuilt the world with violence and beauty, much like the lives of the people who clung to its soil. A full year had passed since the explosion that had nearly shattered the Singing River Valley, and the summer of 1879 brought a wind that tasted less of copper dust and more of hope. Red Mesa was no longer the same town that had once sneered at a lonely spinster. The raw, bleeding edges of the frontier had begun to heal. The row of saloons that had once dominated Main Street had thinned out, replaced in part by businesses of substance. The noise of drunken brawls and gunfire had faded, giving way to the rhythmic ringing of the blacksmith's hammer and the laughter of children. At the edge of town, where the sagebrush met the new timber fencing, stood a building that symbolized this new era. It was a schoolhouse, built from sturdy pine and painted a crisp white. Inside, the air smelled of chalk dust and dried lavender. Clara Boone stood before the blackboard. She held a piece of chalk in fingers that were no longer stained with the red dirt of loneliness. She wore a dress of simple blue cotton, tailored to fit a form she no longer tried to hide. Her hair was pulled back, not in the severe, defensive knot of the past, but in a soft braid that allowed the light to catch the golden streaks earned from days in the sun. "Now," Clara said, her voice clear and commanding, "who can tell me the word for water?" A dozen hands shot up. The class was a tapestry of the territory. There were the sons of miners, with faces scrubbed pink, sitting next to Shoshone children with eyes like dark obsidian. "Little Bear," Clara said, nodding to the boy who had once run through the night to warn of dynamite. "In English, it is water," the boy said proudly. "In Shoshone, it is Pa." "Correct," Clara smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached her amber eyes and crinkled the corners. She turned to write both words on the board. She did not hunch her shoulders. She did not flinch when the door opened. She simply turned, expecting a parent or perhaps Dr. Miller. For a year, she had been the bridge between the town and the tribe. She was a co-owner of the Caro Boone mining concern, a woman of property and standing. When she walked down the street now, men tipped their hats not out of pity, but out of respect. The women who had once whispered behind their fans now asked her for advice on herbal teas or remedies for a fever. But the door had not opened for a parent. Standing in the frame, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun, was a man. He wore a dusty travel coat and simple boots. He carried no cane, no silk hat, and he was not surrounded by a phalanx of lawyers and accountants. He stood alone, holding a worn leather satchel. The chalk snapped in Clara's hand. Silas Caro had returned. He looked different. The softness of the Eastern highlife had been burned away. His face was leaner, tanned by wind and sun. There were new lines around his eyes, marks of a year spent fighting battles in boardrooms that were just as vicious as any gunfight. But his eyes were the same steel gray, intelligent, and currently fixed on her with an intensity that made the rest of the room vanish. "Class dismissed," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. The children did not need to be told twice. They scrambled for their pails and bonnets, rushing past the stranger in the doorway, spilling out into the sunshine. Silas stepped inside. He closed the door, shutting out the noise of the world. "Hello, Clara," he said. "You are late," Clara replied, her voice trembling slightly. "The train arrived an hour ago." "I walked," Silas said. "I wanted to see the bridge, the one your prophets built." He took a step closer. He did not look like a tycoon. He looked like a man who had walked through fire to get to the other side. "It is a good bridge," Silas noted. "Strong, like the woman who commissioned it." "And you?" Clara asked, gripping the edge of her desk. "Are you strong, Silas, or are you still tethered?" Silas dropped his satchel. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was not a contract. It was a letter from a bank in New York, stamped with the word "paid in full." "I have no mines in Pennsylvania anymore," Silas said quietly. "I have no shipping shares in Boston. The mansion on Fifth Avenue belongs to a railroad baron now. I'm afraid, Miss Boone, that I am no longer a king of industry. I am merely a minority partner in a small, ethical mining operation in Colorado." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "And I have never been freer." Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 365 days. She walked around the desk. She stopped 2 feet from him. "And the engagement?" she asked, needing to hear it. "Beatrice sent me a very polite note," Silas said with a faint, wry smile. "She married a duke 3 months ago. She was quite relieved. I think she found me entirely too intense." Clara looked at him, this man who had dismantled an empire to keep a promise. "You look tired, Silas," she said softly. "I have been riding toward you for a year," he whispered. "I am exhausted." Clara reached out and took his hand. His skin was rougher than she remembered. "Then come," she said. "Let us go to the river. The water washes everything away." They rode out to the valley as the sun began its descent, painting the canyon walls in the familiar shades of bruised purple and burning gold. The mining camp was unrecognizable from the chaos of the year before. There were no steam shovels tearing at the earth. Instead, a small crew of men worked alongside Shoshone laborers, using sluice boxes and hand pans in the designated zone downstream. It was quiet work, respectful work. The foreman waved as they passed. Silas waved back. Not as a master, but as a colleague. They dismounted at the bend in the river where the willows grew thick and green, the place where they had shared their first kiss, and where Silas had first broken her heart. The water was clear now, the mud and debris long gone. It flowed over the white stones, singing its eternal song. Clara sat on a large flat rock. She took off her bonnet and let the breeze catch the loose strands of her hair. She did not look away when Silas studied her face. The shame was gone. The mirror in her room had been thrown out months ago. She knew who she was. "It has been a hard year," Silas said, sitting beside her, close enough that their arms touched. "There were days in New York when I thought the banks would eat me alive. They called me a fool. They said I was throwing away a dynasty for a dust bowl." "And did you believe them?" Clara asked. "I looked at the balance sheets," Silas admitted, "and they were right. By their math, I was ruined." He picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water. It jumped 3 times before sinking. "But then I would remember the way you looked standing on that boulder, commanding an army," Silas said, turning to her. "I would remember the feel of the mud on my knees when I begged you to marry me, and I realized that their math was broken. They were counting gold. I was counting life." Clara smiled, looking at the river. "We have done good work here. Silas, the clinic has saved 3 children this winter. The tribe has blankets and medicine without begging for government scraps. The gold comes out of the ground, but it does not poison us anymore. Because of you," Silas said. "You taught me that the earth is not a ledger to be balanced." He shifted, turning his body fully toward her. The atmosphere changed. The casual comfort of the reunion tightened into something electric and solemn. Silas slid off the rock. For the second time in his life, he went down on one knee before her. But this time, there was no gunfire. There was no blood on his face. There was no desperate crowd watching. There was only the wind in the cottonwoods and the cry of a hawk circling high above. "Clara," Silas said. His voice was steady, deep, and filled with a certainty that shook her soul. "The last time I did this," he began, "the world was exploding. I asked you to marry me to save the valley. I asked you in the heat of battle." He reached into his vest pocket. "Today, there is no battle," Silas continued. "There is no crisis. I am not asking you to save me, or the land, or your reputation. I am here as a man who has seen the great cities of the East and found them empty compared to 1 hour by your side." He opened his hand. Lying on his palm was not a diamond solitaire from a New York jeweler. It was a band of silver, hammered and shaped by hand. Etched into the metal were the geometric patterns of the Shoshone symbols of water, mountains, and eternal connection. "Ravenhawk gave me the silver," Silas explained softly. "He said that if I brought you a stone from the ground, he would throw me in the river. He said a circle has no beginning and no end, like the water." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The ring was perfect. It was not a display of wealth. It was a promise of belonging. "They said you were too plain," Silas whispered, repeating the words that had once been a curse, now transforming them into a prayer. "But you are the most beautiful thing God ever made. You are the willow that does not break. You are the river that sings." He looked up into her eyes, baring his soul. "Clara Boone, I have chosen. I choose the dust. I choose the wind. I choose you. Will you marry me? Will you walk this path with me? Not as my savior, but as my wife?" Clara looked at him. She thought of the lonely nights in the boarding house. She thought of the laughter in the saloon. She thought of the map her father had left her. All those roads had led here, to this quiet, holy moment. She did not say yes immediately. She let the silence stretch, savoring the freedom of the choice. She looked at his face, the face of a man who had learned humility. She smiled, and it was blinding. "I am not easy, Silas Caro," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I am stubborn. I talk back, and I will never let you win an argument about this land. I am counting on it." Silas grinned, hoping to light up his eyes. "Then yes," Clara said. "Yes, I will marry you." Silas let out a laugh of pure joy. He slid the silver ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He stood up and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that had been stored up for a year, a kiss that tasted of redemption and homecoming. High above them, on the lip of the Red Canyon wall, a rider sat on a black stallion. Ravenhawk watched the 2 figures by the water. He saw them embrace. He saw the light flash off the silver band he had crafted by his own fire. He felt a pang in his chest, the old echo of a love that could not be, but beneath it, there was peace. The gold man had returned. He had kept his word. He had honored the tribe and the land. Ravenhawk was a leader now. He sat on the council. He had guided his people through the transition, securing their place in a world that wanted to erase them. He knew that as long as Clara and Silas stood guard in the valley, the singing river would flow. He raised his hand in a silent salute to the couple below. Suvate, he whispered to the wind. He turned night wind away from the edge. He did not look back. He rode toward the northern peaks, where the air was thin and cold, and where a warrior could find his own kind of freedom under the vast, open sky. Down by the river, the sun finally dipped below the horizon. Clara pulled back from the kiss. She looked at her reflection in the calm water of the pool. She saw a woman with wind-blown hair. She saw a woman wearing a silver ring. She saw a woman who was loved. The cracked mirror of the past was gone. In the water, she saw only the truth. "What are you looking at?" Silas asked, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. Clara leaned back against him, closing her eyes. "I am looking at the future," she said. And in the twilight of the Wild West, amidst the scent of sage and cooling stone, Clara Boone, the woman they said was too plain, too ugly to marry, stood in the center of her own kingdom, richer than any tycoon, for she held the only gold that truly mattered, a heart that was free, moral, and impact. In the rugged history of the West, where gold often defined the worth of a man and beauty defined the worth of a woman, there lies a valley that tells a different story. It tells us that the greatest treasure is not what can be dug from the earth, but what can be forged in the fire of integrity. Clara and Silas teach us that true beauty is courage, and true wealth is the ability to choose love over greed. The plain girl found a love that saw her soul, and the rich man found a conscience that saved his life. The warrior kept his freedom, and the land kept its song. It is a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, the human heart remains the wildest and most resilient frontier of all. Thank you, dear friends, for riding along on this journey through the dust and destiny of Red Mesa. I hope the story of Clara and Silas has warmed your spirit like a campfire on a cold desert night. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in a bustling city like Silas, or a quiet corner of the world like Clara's Valley? Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on their journey. If you enjoyed this tale of love, courage, and the true spirit of the West, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Give this video a like to help us keep the fire burning, and hit that hype button so this story can reach more travelers on the trail. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.